Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Secrets channel. Tonight we step into a desert that seems determined to test every limit of human endurance, where the sun presses down like a heavy hand and the ground shimmers with heat. You might think survival here means constant struggle, endless thirst and restless nights spent tossing in the warmth that never quite leaves. But what if the secret to comfort was not above ground at all, but hidden just beneath your feet? What if entire communities quietly mastered the art of cooling without machines, without electricity, using only earth air and patience? So before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And as you listen tonight, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights and imagine yourself walking slowly across a wide sunlit plain where the air feels dry enough to crack your lips with each breath. The light is almost blinding. It reflects off pale sand and dusty stone, making everything appear sharper than it should. Heat rises in wavering currents, bending the horizon into something uncertain and fluid. You feel it on your skin, immediately a steady pressing warmth that seeps through fabric and settles into your muscles. Even the wind, when it comes, offers little relief. It arrives hot and thin, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and sun-baked earth. You keep walking. Your footsteps crunch softly against the ground, a brittle sound that seems swallowed by the vast openness around you. There are no tall trees here, no deep shadows to retreat into, just scattered shrubs, low and stubborn, clinging to life. The sky stretches endlessly above a pale blue that feels distant and indifferent. And yet people have lived here, thrived even. That thought lingers as you approach a slight rise in the land, something subtle, almost easy to miss. At first it looks like a mound, a gentle swelling of earth covered in grass and packed soil. Not a building in the way you might expect. No sharp edges, no gleaming surfaces, just a quiet shape blending into the landscape as if it belongs there completely. You hesitate for a moment, because this is not what you imagined. When most people picture homes in harsh climates, they think of tents or elevated structures, something that tries to escape the heat by rising above it. But here the approach is different, almost counterintuitive. Instead of fighting the environment, this structure seems to lean into it, to become part of it. You step closer, noticing the texture beneath your feet change slightly, the ground firmer, more compact. The air feels still here, as though the mound itself is holding its breath. There's a faint smell now, richer than before, something earthy and cool beneath the dry surface scent. Then you see the entrance. Low and modest, framed with wooden supports darkened by time, it opens into shadow. The contrast is striking. Outside everything is bright and exposed. Inside there is only darkness, soft and inviting. You feel a subtle shift in temperature, even before stepping in, a whisper of cool air brushing against your face. It feels like relief. You duck slightly and immediately the world changes. The harsh brightness disappears, replaced by a dim filtered light that seeps gently through the space. Your eyes take a moment to adjust, and as they do, you become aware of the temperature. It is cooler here, not cold, not dramatically so, but enough that your body relaxes almost without permission. A quiet exhale escapes you. The air is thicker, calmer. It carries the scent of soil and wood, a grounded, steady smell that feels oddly comforting. Beneath your feet, the surface is firm but not harsh packed earth that seems to hold a quiet memory of the coolness below. You pause, because the difference is undeniable. Outside, the heat presses, constantly demanding attention. Inside, it fades into the background, something distant and manageable. The transition feels almost like stepping into another world, one where the rules of the desert no longer apply in quite the same way. This is an earth lodge, a structure used by various Native American groups, particularly in regions where temperatures could swing dramatically between day and night. While not exclusive to desert environments, similar principles were adapted in arid landscapes to create spaces that resisted extreme heat. The basic idea is deceptively simple. Use the earth itself as insulation, allowing its natural properties to stabilize temperature. And it works remarkably well. The thick walls, made from layers of soil grass and wooden frames, absorb heat slowly during the day, Instead of letting it rush inside, they hold it, delaying its movement. By the time that heat begins to seep inward, the outside temperature has already started to drop. The result is a space that remains relatively cool during the hottest hours. It's a quiet kind of engineering. No noise, no moving parts, just patience and understanding. You take a few steps further inside, noticing how sound behaves differently here. Outside, even the faintest breeze carried a sharp, dry whisper. Inside, everything is softened. Your movements are quieter, your breathing more noticeable. It feels almost like the lodge is gently absorbing the world's noise, leaving only a calm, steady silence behind. There's a central space ahead, slightly more open, where light filters down from a small opening above. It's not bright just enough to illuminate shapes and movement. The light itself feels gentle, diffused by the structure, lacking the harsh intensity of the sun outside. You tilt your head slightly, listening. There's a faint creak of wood, a subtle shift as the structure settles. Perhaps the distant sound of wind brushing over the top, muted and distant. The lodge does not block the world entirely. It simply softens, it reshapes it into something more livable. Historians generally agree that these structures were carefully designed to suit their environments, reflecting generations of observation and adaptation. Yet there's still some debate about how much of their cooling effect was intentional design versus gradual refinement over time. Did early builders fully understand the thermal properties at play, or did they simply notice what worked and pass it on? The answer is not entirely clear, but standing here feeling the difference yourself, it's hard to believe it was accidental. There's also a lesser-known detail that often surprises people. Some accounts suggest that the placement of lodges within a settlement was planned to maximize airflow and shade, using nearby features like small rises or vegetation to enhance cooling. It wasn't just the structure itself, but its relationship to the land around it. Everything worked together. You reach out and place your hand lightly against the wall. It feels cool. Not damp, not cold in a sharp way, but steadily, quietly cool. The kind of coolness that doesn't shock your skin, but instead eases into it. You leave your hand there for a moment longer than necessary just to feel it. Outside, the sun continues its relentless climb. Inside, time seems to slow, and as you stand there in this calm earthen space, you begin to understand something simple and profound. Comfort here was never about escaping the desert. It was about learning to live with it, to shape it, to listen carefully to what it allowed. The lodge doesn't fight the heat, it outweights it. You linger just inside the entrance, letting your eyes adjust fully to the gentle dimness. The brightness outside already feels distant, like a memory that fades faster than expected. Inside the lodge, the air settles around you with a quiet steadiness, neither still nor moving, simply present in a way that feels balanced. You take a few more steps inward. The space opens gradually, not all at once, revealing its shape in soft layers of shadow and filtered light. Wooden beams curve overhead, forming a rounded ceiling that feels both protective and intentional. They are thick, sturdy, and slightly rough, each one carrying the faint scent of aged timber warmed by years of subtle heat and cooling cycles. It feels grounded. The floor beneath you is smooth, packed earth, cool against your feet even through thin soles. There's a softness to it, not in texture but in temperature. It does not radiate heat upward the way stone or sand outside would. Instead, it seems to absorb and hold a quiet chill, like a memory of the night still lingering beneath the surface. You notice how your breathing changes. Slower now. Deeper. There's a calm here that isn't just physical. It seeps into your body, gradually encouraging stillness without demanding it. A kind of calm that arrives naturally without effort. A faint rustle draws your attention upward. Near the center of the roof, a small opening allows a column of light to fall gently into the space. It's not harsh. It doesn't glare. Instead, it spreads softly, illuminating dust particles that drift lazily in the air. The opening serves more than one purpose, allowing smoke to escape and air to circulate, but in this moment, it feels almost like a quiet connection to the sky above. You tilt your head slightly, watching the light shift. As the sun moves even subtly, the angle changes and the glow shifts across the interior. It never becomes overwhelming. The structure filters it, softens it, turning something intense into something manageable. This is not accidental. Earth lodges were typically constructed with a central smoke hole carefully positioned to balance light and ventilation. The design allowed hot air to rise and escape, drawing cooler air inward from lower openings. It's a simple principle, one that feels almost obvious once you experience it, yet remarkably effective in practice. And yet there's still discussion among scholars about how precise these design choices were. Some suggest that while the overall structure clearly promotes airflow, the exact positioning of openings may have varied, widely influenced by local conditions rather than strict rules. In other words, flexibility may have been just as important as consistency. You walk slowly along the inner edge of the lodge. The walls curve gently, enclosing the space without feeling restrictive. There are areas where items might be stored or where people would sit or rest, each spot subtly shaped by use over time. Nothing feels rigid or overly planned. Instead, everything seems to have grown into place, guided by daily life rather than imposed design. You reach out again. Your fingers brush against the surface of the wall, tracing the slight irregularities in the packed earth. It's firm but not unyielding. There's a quiet resilience to it, a sense that it can endure both heat and time without losing its purpose. The smell here is different from outside, richer. There's the scent of soil, yes, but also something faintly sweet, perhaps from dried grasses used in construction. It lingers gently in the air, never overwhelming, just enough to remind you that this space is alive in its own quiet way. A short pause settles around you. You listen. There's a faint, almost imperceptible hum, not from machinery or movement, but from the environment itself. The subtle interaction of air, structure, and distant wind. It's easy to miss at first, but once noticed, it becomes part of the experience, a soft background note that reinforces the sense of shelter. Outside, the desert continues its relentless rhythm. Inside, everything feels measured. There's a small detail that often goes unnoticed. Some early observers noted that the entrance to these lodges was sometimes angled or extended slightly outward, creating a kind of tunnel effect. This wasn't just for structural support. It helped limit the direct entry of sunlight and hot air, acting as a buffer between the intense exterior and the cooler interior. You glance back toward the entrance. Now that you're deeper inside, it appears smaller, framed by shadow, its brightness softened by distance. The contrast that once felt sharp has mellowed, becoming part of a gradual transition rather than an abrupt shift. It's a thoughtful design, even if it emerged slowly over generations. You imagine what it must feel like at the peak of midday, when the sun is highest and the outside world becomes almost unbearable. Here within these walls, the difference would be even more pronounced. The lodge would not eliminate the heat entirely, but it would temper it, reduce its intensity to something livable, something manageable. You take a seat along the edge. The surface beneath you is firm but comfortable, shaped by a repeated use. There's no cushion, no fabric, and yet it doesn't feel harsh. The temperature of the ground seems to meet your body halfway, neither warm nor cold, simply steady. It's enough. There's a quiet satisfaction in that realization. Comfort doesn't always come from adding more. Sometimes it comes from understanding what's already there and using it wisely. The people who built and lived in these lodges didn't rely on excess. They relied on observation, on patience, on a deep familiarity with their environment, and perhaps a bit of trial and error. Because not every structure would have been perfect. Some may have held too much heat, others not enough. Adjustments would have been made, techniques refined, small changes passed down and remembered. Over time, what worked best would remain, becoming part of a shared knowledge that shaped entire communities. You shift slightly, feeling the coolness beneath you again. It hasn't changed. Outside, the temperature continues to rise, but here the effect is delayed, softened by layers of earth and thoughtful design. The lodge doesn't react quickly. It responds slowly, absorbing, holding, releasing heat in a measured way that keeps extremes at bay. It's a kind of quiet resistance. Not forceful, not dramatic, just steady. And as you sit there in the dim light and calm air, you begin to sense how this space is more than just shelter. It's a solution, yes, but also a reflection of a way of thinking. One that values balance over control, adaptation over domination. A way of living that listens first. then builds. You remain seated for a moment longer, letting the coolness settle deeper into your body before slowly rising again. The lodge feels familiar already, as if your senses have begun to adjust to its quiet rhythm. Nothing here demands attention, yet everything invites it. You take a slow step toward one of the walls. Up close, the construction reveals itself in subtle layers. What first appeared as a single mass of earth now shows faint variations in texture and colour. Thin lines where soil was pressed and shaped. Slight differences in tone where grass or clay may have been mixed in. It is not decorative, but it is detailed in its own understated way. You run your fingers along the surface again. There's a faint roughness softened by time. Small fragments of dried plant fibres are embedded within the earth, giving it strength and flexibility. It's not just dirt. It's a carefully combined material shaped with intention and knowledge that feels both practical and intuitive. Building like this takes patience and a deep understanding of the land. You step back slightly, imagining the process as it unfolds. First, the ground would be dug out, creating a shallow depression. Not too deep, just enough to lower the floor below the surrounding surface. This alone would already offer some cooling, as the temperature beneath the ground remains more stable than above it. A simple but powerful start. Then a framework of wooden posts and beams would be constructed, forming the skeleton of the lodge. These beams, often cut from nearby trees, would be arranged in a circular or slightly oval shape, leaning inward to support the roof. Each piece would need to be strong positioned carefully to distribute weight evenly. You glance up again. The structure above you feels solid, dependable. No unnecessary movement, just quiet strength. Over this wooden frame, layers of branches, grasses, and other plant materials would be placed. These layers serve multiple purposes, acting as both support and insulation. They create small pockets of air, which help slow the transfer of heat. It's a subtle detail, but an important one. Air itself becomes part of the design. Finally, earth would be piled on top. Thick, heavy, and carefully packed, it forms the outer shell of the lodge. This layer is what gives the structure its distinctive mound-like appearance. It also provides the bulk of its insulating power, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly over time. You pause, because this is where the real magic happens. The earth doesn't just block heat, it manages it. During the hottest hours, when the sun is strongest, the outer layer absorbs much of that energy, but it takes time for that heat to move inward. By the time it reaches the interior, the outside air has already begun to cool. A delayed effect. Simple, brilliant. Historians widely recognize this as an early example of passive climate control long before the term ever existed. The builders may not have described it in scientific language, but they understood the outcome. They knew what worked, and they repeated it with care. Still, there's some uncertainty about how standardized these methods were. Different groups living in different regions likely adapted the design to suit local conditions. Soil type, available vegetation, and seasonal weather patterns would all influence the final structure. So while the general concept remained consistent, the details may have varied more than we realize. You take a slow breath. The scent of earth feels stronger near the wall, mixed with a faint dryness from the grasses within. It's a natural smell, grounding and steady, nothing artificial or sharp. It lingers, gently, never overwhelming. You shift your weight slightly, noticing how the floor responds. Firm but not rigid, it holds you comfortably without the hardness you might expect. The slight give beneath your feet suggests careful preparation, perhaps layers of compacted soil smoothed over time by repeated use. It's a surface designed for living, not just standing. There's a quiet detail you might not In some cases, builders added a thin layer of clay to the outer surface, creating a more weather-resistant shell. This helped protect the structure from rain and wind while also enhancing its insulating properties. It's a small addition, but one that reflects careful attention to durability. You walk slowly around the interior. Each step feels deliberate, not because you have to be careful, but because the space encourages it. The curved walls guide your movement, creating a natural flow that feels almost instinctive. There are no sharp corners, no abrupt transitions. Everything is gradual. Everything is considered. Outside, the sun continues its steady climb, but inside the effect remains distant. The layers above you are doing their work quietly without interruption. There's no sudden shift in temperature, no uncomfortable pockets of heat. Just a consistent, gentle coolness that holds steady. You pause again, listening. The faint sounds from outside are still there, but softened, filtered through layers of earth and plant material. The wind, which once felt sharp and dry, now arrives as a muted whisper. Even your own movements seem quieter, absorbed by the structure around you. It feels protective, not in a dramatic way, just enough. You imagine the effort it would take to build something like this. The gathering of materials, the shaping of earth, the careful placement of each beam and layer. It's not a quick process. It requires time, cooperation, and a shared understanding of what needs to be done. This is not a solitary task. It's communal, and perhaps that's part of its strength. When knowledge is shared, refined, and passed down through generations, it becomes more than just technique. It becomes tradition, a way of living that carries both practical and cultural meaning. You rest your hand once more against the wall, cool, steady, unchanging. Outside, the desert continues its endless cycle of heat and light. Inside, the lodge holds its quiet balance shaped by earth, guided by experience and sustained by a deep connection to the land. And as you stand there surrounded by layers of thoughtful construction, you begin to see the lodge not just as shelter, but as a conversation between people and place, one that has been unfolding for generations. You stand quietly near the centre of the lodge, letting your senses settle into its steady rhythm. The coolness you felt at first is no longer surprising. It has become expected, almost invisible, like something your body now trusts without question. You take a slow breath. The air feels balanced, not too dry, not too heavy, just enough to feel comfortable even as the desert outside continues to heat. There is no sudden movement here, no rush of wind or sharp drafts. And yet the air is not stagnant. It moves gently, almost imperceptibly. You begin to notice it, a faint shift across your skin. It's subtle, easy to miss, but it's there. You glance upward again toward the small opening in the roof where that soft column of light still filters down. It seems quiet, almost decorative at first glance, but it is doing something important. Hot air rises. That's the principle at work here, simple and reliable. As the air inside warms slightly, it drifts upward toward the opening. Slowly, steadily it escapes. In its place, cooler air is drawn inward from the lower entrance and tiny gaps within the structure. A continuous exchange. You can almost feel it now, that gentle cycle. Not a breeze, not a gust, just a quiet circulation that keeps the air from becoming heavy or stale. It's a system that works without effort, without noise, relying only on the natural behavior of heat and air. You shift your stance slightly, testing it. The sensation changes just enough to notice a faint difference depending on where you stand. Near the entrance, there is a slightly cooler touch as fresh air moves inward. Toward the center, the air feels more neutral, balanced between incoming and outgoing flow. It's a delicate equilibrium. Historians and scientists often describe this as passive ventilation, a method of regulating airflow without mechanical systems. In Earth lodges, this effect was enhanced by the structure's shape, the positioning of openings, and the materials used. Everything worked together to guide the movement of air in a way that felt almost effortless. But not everyone agrees on how precisely this was controlled. Some researchers suggest that while the basic airflow principles are clear, the exact effectiveness may have varied depending on construction quality and environmental conditions. In other words, some lodges likely perform better than others. Still, even a modest version of this system would have made a noticeable difference. You walk slowly towards the entrance again. The light grows slightly brighter, but it no longer feels harsh. Your eyes have adjusted and the transition is smoother now. You pause near the threshold, feeling the contrast between inside and outside air more clearly. A faint wave of warmth brushes your face. It's immediate. Outside, the heat is waiting. You don't step out yet. Instead, you linger at the edge, one foot in shadow, the other closer to the light. The difference in temperature is subtle but distinct. Inside, the air feels contained, moderated. Outside it feels open and intense, carrying the full weight of the sun. You step back again, returning to the cool. There's a quiet satisfaction in that choice. You begin to notice another detail. The thickness of the walls doesn't just slow heat transfer, it also stabilizes temperature over time. Even as the outside air fluctuates, rising quickly during the day and dropping at night, the interior changes much more slowly. This creates a kind of thermal memory. The lodge remembers the cooler night, holding onto that chill well into the day. By the time the heat begins to penetrate inward, the outside temperature is already falling again. The cycle continues, smoothing out extremes and creating a more consistent environment inside. It's not perfect, but it's remarkably effective. There's an interesting detail that often surprises modern observers. In some cases, the entrance passage was designed with a slight downward slope before rising into the main chamber. This could help trap cooler air inside, preventing it from easily escaping while still allowing fresh air to enter. A small adjustment, a big impact. You take a slow step toward the center again, noticing how the air feels slightly different with each movement. It's not dramatic, but it's present. A living system responding quietly to heat, structure, and time. You close your eyes for a moment just to feel it, the faint brush of air across your skin, the steady coolness beneath your feet, the absence of harsh sunlight pressing against your eyelids. It's a sensory shift that feels almost gentle, as if the lodge is easing the desert's intensity rather than blocking it completely. There's a kind of wisdom in that approach. Instead of resisting the environment outright, the structure works with it. It allows heat to rise, guides air to move, and uses the Earth's natural properties to create balance. Nothing is forced. Nothing is wasted. Everything has a role. You open your eyes again. The light above has shifted slightly, marking the slow passage of time. Outside, the sun is climbing higher, intensifying the heat across the landscape. But here inside the lodge, the change is barely noticeable. The system continues, quietly. There's a lesser-known observation recorded by some early visitors. They noted that even during particularly hot days, the interior of well-built lodges could remain significantly cooler than the outside air, sometimes by several degrees. While exact measurements were rarely taken, the difference was enough to be felt clearly by anyone stepping inside. You smile slightly, because you felt it too. It's not dramatic, not shocking, but it's real, and it's enough. You move once more toward the wall, placing your hand against it again. The coolness remains steady, unaffected by the rising heat outside. The earth holds its temperature with quiet confidence, resisting sudden change. It doesn't rush. It doesn't react. It simply endures. And as you stand there, surrounded by this subtle, effective system of airflow and insulation, you begin to understand something deeper. The lodge is not just built to provide shelter. It's built to create balance, to smooth out extremes, to make the harshness of the desert more manageable, not by overpowering it, but by working alongside it. A quiet partnership between structure and environment, one that you can feel with every breath. You remain near the center of the lodge, letting the steady rhythm of air and temperature settle into something familiar. What once felt unusual now feels natural, almost expected, as if your body is quietly adjusted to this calm, balanced environment. You take us down. Took a slow look around. The interior no longer seems dim. Instead, it feels gently lit, the kind of soft illumination that allows your eyes to rest rather than strain. Shapes become clearer edges, more defined, and the space reveals itself not as empty but as lived in. This is not just shelter. It is a home. You begin to imagine the quiet flow of daily life within these walls. People moving slowly through the space, their footsteps softened by the packed earth beneath them. Conversations carried in low, steady tones, never needing to rise above the gentle acoustics of the lodge. Sound behaves differently here. It lingers briefly, then fades. A voice does not echo sharply, but instead seems to settle into the air, blending with the stillness. Even small movements like the shifting of weight or the brushing of fabric become part of a subtle background rhythm. You listen. There is no urgency in these sounds, only continuity. You take a few steps toward one side of the lodge where the wall curves inward slightly, creating a natural place to sit or rest. You lower yourself slowly, feeling the familiar coolness rise through the ground. It's consistent, dependable, like the steady breath of the structure itself. Outside, the heat continues to build. Inside, time stretches. There's a faint scent now different from earlier. A hint of something warm, perhaps, from a small fire that might have been used here. Not strong, not smoky, just a lingering trace that blends with the earthy smell of the walls and floor. It feels lived in. In many earth lodges, a central fire was an important feature used for cooking warmth during cooler nights and light. The smoke would rise toward the opening above, escaping gradually while leaving behind only the faintest trace. The design allowed fire to exist within the space without overwhelming it with heat, a careful balance. Source. You imagine the fire now, low and steady, its glow reflecting softly against the curved walls. The warmth it provides would be gentle, contained, never competing with the cooling effects of the earth. Instead, it would complement them, adding just enough heat when needed. Not too much, never too much. There's an interesting detail that often goes unnoticed. Some accounts suggest that people would adjust the size or intensity of the fire depending on the time of day, using it more during cooler mornings or evenings, and letting it fade during the hottest hours. It was not constant but responsive. Everything here responds to time, to temperature, to need. You shift slightly, leaning back against the wall. The surface is firm but not uncomfortable. Its coolness steady against your back. It supports you without effort, as if it has done so countless times before. You close your eyes briefly, just for a moment. The air feels calm against your skin, neither still nor moving, simply present. There is no harsh sunlight pressing through your eyelids, no sharp wind to distract you. Only a quiet, even atmosphere that encourages rest without demanding it. A soft pause. You open your eyes again. There's a sense that life inside this lodge follows a different pace. Outside, the desert moves in extremes, intense heat during the day, cooler air at night. Inside, those extremes are softened, stretched out, made more manageable. This changes everything. Daily activities would naturally shift to match this environment. Tasks that required more effort might be done during the cooler hours of morning or evening, while the hottest part of the day could be spent resting, talking, or simply being still inside the lodge, a rhythm shaped by comfort. Historians generally agree that such structures played a significant role in making life sustainable in challenging climates. By reducing exposure to extreme heat, they allowed people to conserve energy and maintain a more stable daily routine. Still, there's some debate about how widespread these practices were in truly arid desert regions. Earth lodges are more commonly associated with certain plains cultures, and while similar techniques were adapted elsewhere, the exact extent of their use in harsher desert environments remains a topic of discussion. The idea, however, remains consistent. Use the land, work with it. You notice another small detail as you sit quietly. The way light moves across the interior, shifting slowly as the sun climbs higher. It never becomes overwhelming, never floods the space. Instead, it traces gentle patterns along the walls and floor, marking time in a quiet, almost meditative way. You follow it with your eyes. The movement is slow, unhurried. There's a sense of continuity here, a feeling that the lodge is not just a static structure, but something that participates in the daily cycle of light and heat. It responds, adjusts, and holds steady, creating an environment that supports life without demanding constant attention. You take a deep breath. The air feels slightly cooler than before, or perhaps your body has simply adjusted more fully. Either way, the comfort remains consistent, a quiet presence that shapes your experience without drawing focus. Outside, the desert continues its relentless pattern. Inside, there is calm. You rest your hands on the ground beside you, feeling the cool earth beneath your palms. It's a simple sensation, but one that carries a quiet reassurance. The ground is steady, the air is balanced. The space is protective. It's enough. And as you sit there surrounded by the subtle signs of daily life, you begin to understand that this lodge is more than a clever solution to heat. It is a place where life unfolds gently, shaped by an environment that has been carefully understood and thoughtfully adapted. A place where comfort is not taken for granted, but created. You begin to notice a quiet shift in the air, so subtle it almost escapes attention at first, as if the lodge itself is gently responding to the rising sun outside. The light filtering from above grows slightly brighter, not harsh, but enough to suggest that morning has fully arrived beyond the sheltering layers of earth and wood. You remain still for a moment, sensing the change not through sight alone, but through temperature, through the faintest adjustment in how the air rests against your skin. Morning has come. You imagine waking here not abruptly but gradually as the soft light above slowly reaches your closed ears, and the cool air of the lodge keeps your body at ease. There is no sharp transition from night to day inside this space. Instead, the change unfolds gently like a slow exhale carried through time. You stretch slightly, feeling the firmness of the ground beneath you, still holding on to the coolness gathers during the night. The lodge remembers the darkness. Outside, the desert is already warming, the sun climbing steadily into a sky that offers little resistance. You can almost picture the light spreading across the land, touching sand and stone, drawing heat upward into the air. But here within these walls, that heat has not yet arrived. The thick layers above you delay its presence, holding it at bay with quiet patience. You rise slowly and take a few steps, noticing how the floor feels unchanged, still cool beneath your feet despite the advancing day. This is the advantage of Earth, its ability to resist sudden shifts, to hold on to what came before while gently preparing for what comes next. It does not rush to match the outside world. It lags behind intentionally, a useful delay. You move closer to the entrance, drawn by the soft glow of the morning light that now frames the opening more clearly. The contrast between inside and outside remains, but it feels less dramatic than before. Your senses have adjusted, and the transition now feels like a gradual slope rather than a sharp edge. Still, the warmth is there. You pause just inside the threshold, feeling a faint wave of heat brush across your face, carried in by the morning air. It is not yet intense, but it carries a promise of what is coming. The desert does not hurry, but it is relentless in its progression. You step back again, returning to the cool. There is a rhythm forming here, one that aligns with the movement of the sun. Morning is a time of preparation, of quiet activity before the full weight of heat settles across the land. Inside the lodge, this period feels extended, stretched by the insulating layers that slow the advance of temperature. You can imagine people beginning their day here, moving calmly through familiar routines, their actions guided not by urgency but by awareness. Tasks might be started early when the air is still gentle, when stepping outside does not yet feel like a challenge. A thoughtful beginning. There is a subtle sound now, faint but present, as the outside world begins to stir, perhaps the distant call of birds or the soft movement of wind across dry grass. Inside the lodge, these sounds arrive, softened, filtered through layers of earth, losing their sharpness and becoming part of a quiet background. You listen carefully. The lodge does not isolate you completely. It allows the world in, but only gently, only in ways that do not disturb the balance within. It is a selective connection, one that preserves calm while maintaining awareness. Historians often note that daily life in such environments required careful timing, with activities structured around the natural cycle of heat and light. Morning and evening became the most active periods, while midday encouraged rest and stillness. This pattern was not imposed but discovered over time and refined. There is some debate, however, about how rigid these routines were. Not every day would follow the same pattern, and different communities likely adapted their schedules based on local conditions, seasonal changes, and specific needs. Flexibility remained essential even within a predictable climate. You turn slightly, looking back into the lodge. The interior remains calm, unchanged in its steady coolness. The light above continues to shift slowly, marking the passage of time in a way that feels almost meditative. There is no clock here, no need for one. The environment itself provides all the signals required. You take a slow breath. The air feels just as blunt as before, neither warming too quickly nor becoming stagnant. The gentle circulation continues, almost invisible, maintaining comfort without drawing attention to itself. It simply works. You walk once more toward the center, letting your steps fall softly against the packed earth. Each movement feels unhurried, as if the space itself encourages a slower pace. There is no pressure to rush, no sense of falling behind. Only presence. Outside, the sun continues its steady climb, preparing to bring the full intensity of midday heat. Inside the lodge holds its ground, maintaining a calm, controlled environment that resists sudden change. And as you stand there aware of the quiet transition from night to morning, you begin to understand how this space supports not just physical comfort, but a way of living that aligns with the rhythms of the land. A gentle beginning, a steady day ahead. You drift a little closer to the entrance again, drawn by the growing brightness outside, where the desert is now fully awakened under the steady rise of the sun. The light feels stronger than before, pressing outward across the land in wide, shimmering waves that blur the edges of distant shapes. You pause at the threshold, noticing how the warmth reaches you. Even before you step out, a quiet warning carried on the air. Midday is approaching. You lean forward slightly, just enough to let the sunlight touch your face more directly, and the difference becomes immediate. The heat feels sharper now, more focused, as if the air itself has thickened with warmth. It rests on your skin with a steady pressure, not painful but persistent in a way that demands attention. You step outside. The brightness floods your vision for a moment, forcing your eyes to narrow as the full intensity of the desert reveals itself again. The ground radiates heat upward, and the air seems to shimmer with movement, bending light into soft distortions that make the horizon feel uncertain. It is intense. The wind, if it can be called that, moves slowly across the land, carrying warmth instead of relief. It brushes against your arms and face with a dry, almost weightless touch, leaving behind the faint scent of heated earth and distant vegetation. You take a few steps forward. Each movement feels slightly heavier here, not because of effort, but because of the environment itself. The heat settles into your body, quickly wrapping around you in a way that feels difficult to ignore. Even your breathing changes, becoming more deliberate as the warm air fills your lungs. This is the desert at midday. Day. Unfiltered, unforgiving in its consistency. You glance back at the lodge. From the outside it appears quiet and unremarkable, its low rounded shape blending into the landscape as if it has always been part of it. There is no visible sign of the coolness inside, no hint of the comfort it holds. It keeps its secret well. You move toward the entrance again. The shift begins before you even cross the threshold. The light softens, the air cools slightly, and the pressure of heat eases just enough to be noticeable. You step inside fully and the contrast becomes clear once more. Relief returns. Not dramatic, but real. The coolness greets you, gently settling over your skin and slowing the heat that had begun to build in your body. Your breathing steadies and the tension you didn't fully notice begins to fade. You pause just inside, letting your body adjust. This difference between outside and inside is not accidental. It is the result of everything working together. The thickness of the walls, the layering of materials, the careful shaping of space. Each element contributes to a system that resists the extremes of midday heat. Historians often point out that structures like these were essential for survival in regions where temperatures could become overwhelming. Without such shelter, the strain of constant exposure to heat would have made daily life far more difficult, even dangerous over time. Still, there is some uncertainty about how consistently effective these lodges were during the hottest periods. Factors like construction quality, maintenance, and local climate variations could influence how well the interior remained cool. Not every lodge would perform the same, but even a modest reduction in heat would matter. You walk slowly back toward the center of the lodge, feeling the steady coolness beneath your feet once again. The air here feels thicker than outside, but in a comforting way, holding its temperature instead of shifting rapidly. It stays stable. You sit down again along the curved wall, letting your back rest against its firm, cool surface. The difference between your time outside and your return inside lingers for a moment, a clear reminder of how much the environment shapes your experience. There's a faint sound above. The wind moving across the top of the lodge, softened by layers of earth and grass. It arrives as a gentle murmur, barely noticeable, yet present enough to remind you of the world beyond the walls. You listen. The lodge does not silence the desert, it transforms it. The harsh edges are softened, the intensity reduced, leaving behind only what can be comfortably experienced. It's not isolation, but more moderation, a level filtering of the environment rather than complete separation. You take a slow breath. The air feels cooler again now, or perhaps your body is fully adjusted after stepping back inside. Either way, the sense of relief remains steady grounded in the consistent temperature of the space. There is a quiet detail you begin to appreciate more deeply. The lodge does not cool instantly, nor does it heat quickly. It changes slowly, maintaining a balance that avoids extremes. This gradual response is what makes it so effective during the harshest part of the day. A steady defense. You rest your hands on the ground again, feeling the familiar coolness beneath your palms. The earth holds its temperature with quiet persistence, resisting the influence of the sun above. Outside, the heat continues to build. Inside, it is held back. And as you sit there aware of the stark contrast between the two environments, you begin to understand how essential this balance would be for daily life. The lodge provides not just comfort, but a necessary pause, a place where the intensity of the desert can be softened enough to endure, a refuge from the peak, a space to recover. Before stepping out again, you remain seated for a while, letting the memory of the outside heat fade from your skin, until the lodge once again feels like the only environment that exists. Time passes quietly here, marked not by urgency, but by subtle changes in light and air that unfold without interruption. The brightness above begins to soften almost imperceptibly at first as the sun slowly shifts beyond its highest point. Afternoon begins to ease. You notice the difference not in temperature, which remains steady, but in the quality of light that filters down from the opening above. It feels warmer in tone, less sharp, as if the intensity of the day is gradually loosening its grip on the land. You stand and stretch gently. The air still feels calm against your skin, unchanged in its quiet balance. But something else is happening now, something more subtle than heat alone. The movement of air begins to shift slightly, responding to the changing conditions outside. You take a slow step toward the center and pause. There it is again, that faint motion just enough to notice. The air seems to move more freely now, no longer held back by the heavy stillness of midday. As the outside temperature begins to drop even slightly, the pressure difference between inside and outside changes. The lodge breathes differently. Cooler air begins to slip inward more easily, drawn gently through the entrance and small gaps within the structure. At the same time, the warmer air inside continues to rise and escape through the opening above, maintaining that quiet cycle of exchange. It becomes more noticeable, not a breeze, but a presence. You tilt your head slightly, feeling the movement across your cheek. It's soft, almost like a whisper, carrying with it a faint hint of the outside world. The scent has changed too, just slightly less of the sharp dryness from earlier, and more of something mellow, as if the land itself is beginning to relax. You walk slowly toward the entrance again. The light there has softened no longer, blinding but still bright enough to remind you of the vast space beyond. You stop just short of stepping out, content to observe the transition from within. The heat is still there, but it is gentler now. You can sense the difference without fully experiencing it, a subtle easing that signals the coming evening. The desert does not cool quickly, but it does change gradually, steadily, in a way that mirrors the slow response of the lodge itself. A shared rhythm. Historians often describe how structures like this worked best not in isolation, but as part of a broader environmental system. The cooling effect of the lodge becomes more pronounced as the outside air begins to drop, allowing for greater airflow and more efficient heat exchange. Still, some researchers suggest that the exact impact of these evening shifts may have depended heavily on local geography. Nearby terrain, wind patterns, and even the orientation of the entrance could influence how effectively air moved through the space. Not every lodge behaved the same, but the principle remained. You step back towards the center again, feeling the air move slightly more than before. It's still gentle, still easy to overlook, but once noticed, it becomes part of the experience, a quiet reminder that the structure is not static. It responds. You sit once more along the curved wall, letting your back rest against the cool surface. The temperature remains steady, but the air feels a touch more alive now, carrying a subtle sense of motion that wasn't present during the peak heat. You close your eyes briefly. The sensation is calming. The faint movement of air across your skin, the steady coolness beneath you, the softened sounds from outside blending into a quiet background. It creates a sense of ease that feels deeper than simple comfort, a gentle transition. You open your eyes again. The light above has shifted further its angle, changing as the sun lowers. The beam no longer falls directly downward, but at a slight angle, tracing a slow path across the interior. It marks time in a way that feels natural, unforced. You follow it with your gaze. It moves slowly, without urgency. There's a small detail that might go unnoticed by many. As the air begins to cool outside, the temperature difference between the outer layers of the lodge and its interior becomes less extreme. This allows the stored heat within the walls to dissipate more gradually, maintaining balance, rather than releasing it all at once. A controlled release. You place your hand against the wall again. It still feels cool though, perhaps slightly less so than earlier. The change is minimal, almost impossible to detect without careful attention. The lodge does not shift quickly. It adjusts in quiet increments. Always steady, outside the desert prepares for evening, the light softening the heat, easing just enough to be felt. Inside the lodge mirrors this change not by reacting suddenly, but by continuing its slow, measured exchange of air and temperature. You take a deep breath. The air feels fresh. Not dramatically different, but subtly renewed, as if the space has taken in just enough of the outside world to refresh itself without losing its calm. And as you sit there, aware of the gentle shift from afternoon toward evening, you begin to understand how this structure does more than protect from heat. It moves with time, adapting quietly to the changing conditions, creating a space that feels alive in its stillness. A place that breathes with the land. You remain seated as the air continues its gentle, almost thoughtful movement, and without quite realizing it, your attention begins to shift from the structure itself to the people who would have filled this space with quiet life. The lodge no longer feels empty. It feels shared. You can almost sense where others might sit, where voices would gather in low conversation, where daily routines would unfold in a rhythm shaped by both comfort and necessity. A lived space. You adjust your posture slightly, imagining vistas arranged along the curved walls, each person finding a place that feels naturally suited to rest or work. The design does not force positions, it suggests them. The circular layout encourages closeness without crowding, allowing sound, warmth and presence to distribute evenly throughout the lodge. No one is too far, no one is isolated. You listen again, and in the quiet it becomes easier to imagine the subtle sounds of shared life, the soft murmur of voices, the occasional shifting of weight, the faint brushing of materials against earth. Nothing sharp, nothing intrusive. The acoustics soften everything, blending individual sounds into a gentle collective presence that never overwhelms the senses. It feels intimate. There is a practical reason for this arrangement. Historians generally agree that communal living within such structures helped regulate not only social bonds but also temperature, as the presence of multiple people contributed small amounts of body heat during cooler periods, especially at night. This shared warmth, though subtle, would have complemented the insulating properties of the lodge itself, creating a more stable environment overall, a quiet cooperation. Still, some scholars suggest that the exact number of occupants and how space was divided inside these lodges likely varied depending on group-size cultural practices and seasonal movement patterns. Not every lodge would have felt the same. Some may have been more crowded, others more sparse. You lean back again, feeling the steady coolness of the wall against your shoulders, and imagine the rhythm of a typical midday inside this space, when the heat outside becomes too strong to ignore. This would be a time of pause, of stillness. People might sit together sharing quiet conversation or simply resting in the moderated air, allowing their bodies to recover from the intensity beyond the walls. No rush here. Tasks would slow naturally, not because of laziness, but because the environment encourages conservation of energy. Movement becomes deliberate, speech becomes softer, even time seems to stretch, expanding gently within the calm boundaries of the lodge, a slower pace. You glance toward the center, where the light from above continues its soft descent, now angled slightly as the sun begins its gradual journey downward. In that space, you imagine small activities taking place, perhaps the preparation of food, the careful handling of tools, or the quiet teaching of younger members, through observation rather than instruction. Learning happens here, not loudly, but steadily. There is an interesting and lesser-known detail that sometimes appears in accounts of Earth Lodge communities. Certain interior spaces may have been subtly designated for specific purposes, not through walls or barriers, but through habit and shared understanding. One area for sleeping, another for storage, another for communal gathering. These divisions were fluid yet resected. You shift your hands along the ground, feeling again the consistent coolness beneath your palms, and it becomes clear how important this environment would be for maintaining both physical comfort and social cohesion. When a space supports calm, it shapes behavior. When it reduces stress, it allows connection to deepen naturally. The lodge encourages togetherness without forcing it. You take a slow breath and the air feels slightly more active now, continuing its gentle circulation as the outside temperature begins to ease. The subtle movement carries with it a sense of renewal, as if the space is quietly refreshing itself in preparation for the evening to come. Outside, the desert remains vast and intense. Inside, the atmosphere stays measured. There is still some uncertainty among historians regarding how social dynamics were structured within these lodges, particularly in terms of hierarchy or assigned roles within the shared space. Some interpretations suggest a high degree of equality in daily life, while others propose more defined social structures that influenced how space was used. The truth may vary, as it often does. You close your eyes briefly again, not from fatigue, but from a growing sense of ease that seems to settle deeper with each passing moment. The lodge has a way of quieting the body without demanding rest, of calming the mind without effort. It creates conditions where stillness feels natural, a rare kind of comfort. You open your eyes once more, taking in the curved walls, the softened light, the steady air, and you begin to understand how this space is not just about escaping the heat, but about shaping a way of living that feels sustainable, balanced, and deeply connected to both environment and community. A shared shelter, a shared rhythm, a shared life. You remain where you are, letting the imagined presence of others fade gently back into the quiet until your attention returns once more to the structure itself, to the materials that surround you, and quietly hold this entire experience together. The walls no longer feel like simple surfaces. They feel responsive, almost alive. You lean forward slightly and press your palm against the earth again, noticing how it greets your touch with that same steady coolness, unchanged despite the long hours of rising heat outside. It holds its ground. There is something remarkable about that consistency. The material does not react quickly. It does not shift with every passing change in temperature. Instead, it absorbs delays and redistributes energy in a way that feels almost patient, as if it understands time differently than the air above it. You keep your hand there for a moment longer, feeling the quiet exchange between your skin and the wall, neither taking more than it needs. It breathes slowly. The composition of these walls is more complex than it first appears. Layers of soil are combined with plant fibers, sometimes mixed with clay, creating a structure that is both dense and slightly flexible. This combination allows the walls to resist cracking, while also enhancing their ability to regulate heat. Air becomes trapped within the tiny spaces between materials, slowing the movement of warmth from outside to inside, a hidden system. You trace a faint line along the surface, noticing subtle variations in texture where different materials meet. Some areas feel smoother, others slightly coarse, depending on how the earth was packed or what was added during construction. These differences are not flaws. They are evidence of process of hands shaping material with care and intention over time. Nothing here is wasted. Historians often highlight how these construction methods reflect a deep understanding of available resources, using what the land provides without excess or unnecessary alteration. The materials are local, familiar, and renewable, chosen not for appearance but for function. This practicality does not diminish the structure. It defines it. Still, there is ongoing discussion about how much experimentation may have been involved in reaching this level of effectiveness. Some researchers suggest that early versions of such lodges may have required adjustments over generations as builders refined techniques based on experience rather than formal knowledge. Trial and error, passed down quietly. You shift slightly and press your other hand to the ground, comparing the sensation beneath you with the wall beside you. The floor feels cooler, still protected by its position below ground level and insulated by the surrounding earth. It holds on to the memory of night more strongly, offering a deeper reserve of coolness that rises gently upward. A quiet reservoir. You notice how the air near the ground feels subtly different from the air above. Not dramatically cooler, but enough to create a layered sensation within the space. This gradient, though slight, contributes to the overall comfort, allowing heat to rise, while cooler air remains closer to where it is most needed. You sit back again, letting that awareness settle. There's a faint smell that becomes more noticeable now, something slightly damp beneath the dryness, a reminder that Earth, even when packed and shaped, retains a connection to moisture deep below the surface. This subtle presence helps stabilize the interior climate, preventing the air from becoming too dry or harsh. It feels balanced. There is an interesting detail that is sometimes overlooked. In certain regions, builders would periodically maintain or refresh the outer layers of the lodge, adding new soil or repairing worn areas to preserve its insulating properties. This was not a one-time construction, but an ongoing relationship with the structure itself. It required care. You glance upward again at the beams that support the roof, noticing how they rest firmly within the earthen layers, working together as a single system rather than separate parts. The wood provides structure. The earth provides insulation. The plant materials bind them together, creating a unified whole. Nothing works alone. Outside, the heat has likely reached its peak, pressing down across the landscape with steady intensity. Inside, the walls continue their quiet work, absorbing and delaying that energy, preventing it from overwhelming the space within. You take a slow breath. The air remains calm, consistent, reliable. There is still some uncertainty among historians regarding how long such structures could maintain their effectiveness without significant maintenance, especially in harsher climates where erosion and weathering might gradually weaken the outer layers. The lifespan of each lodge would depend on both environment and care. Not all endured equally, but many lasted long enough to matter. You rest your hands loosely on your knees, feeling the contrast between your own warmth and the cool environment that surrounds you. The lodge does not eliminate heat entirely, it moderates it, shaping it into something manageable, something that does not demand constant attention. A quiet transformation, and as you sit there, surrounded by materials that seem to breathe and respond without ever drawing focus to themselves, you begin to understand how this structure achieves its effect not through complexity, but through harmony. Each layer, each element, each small detail contributes to a system that works quietly in the background, always working, never demanding, just enough. You remain seated in that steady quiet, and after a while your attention drifts towards something that might seem contradictory at first, the idea of fire existing within a space designed so carefully to stay cool. It feels almost unlikely. Fire means heat. Heat means discomfort. And yet here both coexist without conflict, balanced in a way that feels almost understated. You glance again toward the center of the lodge where that opening above allows light to fall gently downward, and you begin to imagine a small fire beneath it, controlled and steady, its presence shaped as carefully as every other element in this space. Not large, never overwhelming, just enough to serve its purpose. A contained warmth. The smoke would rise slowly, drawn upward by the natural movement of heated air slipping through the opening above without lingering too heavily in the space below. This is not accidental. The same principle that allows hot air to escape also ensures that smoke follows, creating a continuous upward flow that keeps the interior breathable. You tilt your head slightly, following that imagined path. It's a simple system yet remarkably effective, relying entirely on the behavior of heat and air, rather than any mechanical intervention. The fire warms what is needed, while the structure ensures that excess heat does not remain trapped inside. Balance again. You shift your position and imagine sitting closer to that central space during a cooler evening when the air outside begins to lose its intensity and the stored heat within the lodge slowly dissipates. In those moments, the fire would provide comfort, not excess, adding a gentle layer of warmth to an already stable environment. It complements the lodge, it does not compete. Historians often note that central hearths played an essential role in daily life not only for the cooking and warmth, but also as a focal point for social interaction. People would gather around it sharing food stories and quiet conversation, the flickering light adding a soft rhythm to the interior space. A shared centre. Still, there is some debate about how frequently fires were maintained during the hottest parts of the day, especially in warmer climates where additional heat might feel unnecessary. Some interpretations suggest that fires were used sparingly during peak heat, while others propose that their use depended more on specific needs than on temperature alone. The evidence varies, as it often does. You place your hand once more against the ground, then lift it slowly, imagining how the warmth from a small fire might spread gently across the floor, rising just enough to be felt without overwhelming the coolness stored within the earth. The materials absorb and redistribute that heat, preventing it from concentrating too quickly in one place. A quiet diffusion. You take a slow breath and in your mind the air carries a faint trace of smoke, not sharp or choking, but soft and earthy, blending with the scent of soil and wood. It lingers lightly, never dominating, just enough to remind you of the fire's presence. Subtle. Controlled. You listen. There is the faint crackle of wood, steady and rhythmic, a sound that feels grounding rather than disruptive. It fits within the lodge's atmosphere, becoming part of the gentle background rather than drawing focus. Nothing here overwhelms. You look upward again, noticing how the opening above serves multiple roles at once, allowing light to enter, air to circulate, and smoke to escape. It is not just a hole in the roof. It is a carefully considered feature central to the function of the entire structure. Everything connects. There's an interesting detail that sometimes appears in historical observations. In certain cases, coverings or adjustable elements may have been used to partially control the opening, allowing occupants to manage air flow or protect against weather when needed. This suggests a level of adaptability that goes beyond fixed design. Responsive design. You shift slightly, imagining how the presence of fire would change the feeling of the space over time, not dramatically but in subtle layers. During cooler hours it adds warmth. During warmer periods it is reduced or allowed to fade. The lodge itself absorbs and moderates these changes, maintaining its steady balance. It adapts, without effort. Outside, the desert continues its cycle, moving slowly from peak heat toward gradual cooling. Inside, the lodge holds its equilibrium, allowing fire to exist without disrupting the calm it has created. You take another slow breath. The air remains comfortable, even with warmth present. There is still some uncertainty among historians regarding how different groups managed ventilation in varying climates, particularly when balancing the need for warmth with the need for cooling. The exact techniques may have differed, shaped by local knowledge and environmental conditions. No single method, only shared principles. You rest your hands loosely in your lap, feeling the steady temperature around you. And you begin to understand how the presence of fire here is not a contradiction but a continuation of the same philosophy that defines the lodge itself. Use what is needed, control what is possible, and allow the rest to settle naturally. A quiet harmony. You remain still as the imagined warmth of the fire fades gently from your thoughts, and your attention shifts instead toward the passage of time beyond a single day, toward the slow changes that come with seasons, even in a land that often feels unchanging. The lodge does not exist for one moment alone. It endures across many. You begin to sense how its design allows it to adapt not dramatically, but through small, thoughtful adjustments that respond to shifting conditions over weeks and months. You glance upward again. The opening above remains constant, yet its effect changes. As the angle of the sun shifts across seasons, the quality of light entering the lodge transforms, sometimes more direct, sometimes softer, altering how warmth and brightness settle within the space. These changes are subtle, but they matter, influencing how the interior feels at different times of the year. A gradual shift. You move your hand along the wall once more, noticing how its temperature remains steady, though you imagine that over longer periods even this stability would adjust slightly. During cooler seasons, the Earth would hold less heat, allowing the interior to feel a bit warmer in contrast to the outside air. During hotter periods, it would retain more of that cooling effect, extending comfort deeper into the day. It responds slowly, but it responds. Historians often point out that such structures were not static solutions, but part of a broader system of seasonal living where people adjusted their habits, their routines, and sometimes even their locations in response to environmental changes. The lodge was one tool among many effective because it could adapt alongside those who used it. Still, there is some uncertainty about how frequently these adjustments were made in different regions. Some communities may have relied heavily on such structures year-round, while others used them more selectively, shifting between different types of shelter, depending on the season. Flexibility mattered, always. You stand and take a few slow steps, imagining how the interior might feel during a cooler morning in a different time of year, when the air outside carries a slight chill and the warmth of a small fire becomes more noticeable. The same walls that now protect you from heat would then help retain warmth, reversing their role without changing their structure. A dual purpose. You pause near the entrance, considering how even small modifications could influence comfort. Perhaps an extra layer of material added to the exterior for insulation, or a slight adjustment to the entrance covering to control airflow. These are not large changes. They are careful refinements. Small shifts, big effects. There is a lesser-known detail that suggests some lodges may have been partially maintained or reshaped over time, with outer layers repaired or reinforced as needed to preserve their effectiveness. This ongoing care would allow the structure to remain functional across changing conditions, rather than degrading with each passing season. It was maintained, not abandoned. You step back toward the center again, feeling the familiar coolness beneath your feet, and you begin to appreciate how the lodge does not resist change, but accommodates it. It allows the environment to shift while gently moderating its extremes, creating a space that remains livable across a wide range of conditions. A steady constant in a changing world. You take a slow breath, noticing how the air still moves gently, maintaining its quiet circulation regardless of the time of year. The system does not rely on precise conditions. It functions across variations, adjusting naturally as temperature differences shift between inside and outside. It adapts quietly, without instruction. There is still some debate among historians about how much of this adaptability was intentional design versus accumulated knowledge over generations. Did builders fully anticipate these seasonal effects, or did they discover them gradually refining their approach over time? The answer remains unclear, but the result is undeniable. You rest your hand lightly against the wall once more, feeling its steady presence, and imagine how many seasons it might have endured, how many cycles of heat and cooling it has absorbed and released without ever losing its purpose. It endures without complaint. Outside, the desert continues its slow transformation, subtle shifts in temperature and light, marking the passage of time. Inside, the lodge mirrors those changes in its own measured way, never rushing, never reacting sharply. Always steady, and as you stand there aware of both the constancy and the quiet adaptability of this space, you begin to understand how it supports not just a moment of comfort, but a sustained way of living, one that can endure across days, seasons, and generations. A structure that listens and responds. You stand quietly, letting the sense of time stretch beyond this single place, and your thoughts begin to wander outward across other landscapes where people face the same relentless heat and found their own ways to endure it. The desert is not unique to one culture. It tests everyone who lives within it. And yet the solutions people create can feel entirely different, shaped by local knowledge, available materials, and long traditions of observation. You take a slow breath. The lodge feels specific, but not alone. You begin to imagine other shelters built in other dry regions, each one responding to heat in its own way. Some rise above the ground, using elevation to catch breezes. Others rely on thick stone walls to absorb and delay heat much like the earth around you. Still others use woven materials allowing air to pass freely while casting shade across the space below. Different ideas. Same challenge. The Earth Lodge, however, stands apart in one quiet but significant way. Instead of lifting itself away from the heat or allowing it to pass through, it embraces the ground itself, using the stable temperature beneath the surface as its primary defense. It does not escape the desert. It settles into it. You glance around again. The walls feel steady, grounded. Historians often compare these lodges to other forms of traditional architecture, noting how each reflects a deep understanding of local conditions. In some desert cultures, structures were designed to maximize airflow, creating constant ventilation to counteract heat. In others, insulation was prioritized, slowing the movement of temperature to maintain interior stability. Both approaches work, in different ways. There is still some debate, however, about how directly these ideas influenced one another. While it is tempting to imagine knowledge spreading between distant cultures, many scholars suggest that similar solutions often emerged independently, shaped by the same environmental pressures rather than direct contact. Parallel innovation. Across distance, you walk slowly along the curved wall, your hand brushing lightly against its surface, and consider how the Earth Lodge represents a particular balance between insulation and airflow. It does not rely entirely on one method. Instead, it combines both, using thick walls to delay heat while allowing gentle circulation to prevent stagnation. A blended solution, quietly effective. There's an interesting detail that sometimes surprises modern observers. In certain regions, people built semi-subterranean homes that functioned in a similar way, using the earth as insulation, while also incorporating openings for ventilation. Though not identical in form, these structures share the same underlying principle. Use the ground, trust its stability. You pause near the center again, looking up at the opening above, and imagine how different this space would feel if it were built with lighter materials, if air flowed freely, but without the stabilizing presence of earth. It might feel cooler in brief moments, but less consistent over time, more vulnerable to sudden changes. Less stable, more reactive. The lodge avoids that. It chooses steadiness. You sit once more, feeling the familiar coolness beneath you, and reflect on how this approach shapes not only comfort, but also behavior. A space that remains stable encourages a slower pace, a more measured way of living, one that does not need to constantly adjust to extremes. It supports calm naturally. Historians generally agree that architecture in challenging climates often reflects a deep integration between environment and daily life, where structures are not just shelters but tools for shaping experience. The Earth Lodge fits within this pattern, offering a way to live within the desert without constant struggle. Still, there is some uncertainty about how widely these specific techniques were adapted across different regions with similar climates. While the principles are universal, the exact forms and materials could vary significantly, depending on local resources and cultural preferences. No single design, only shared ideas. You take a slow breath, noticing how the air continues its gentle movement, unchanged by your reflections, steady in its quiet cycle. The lodge does not compare itself to other structures. It simply works in its own way within its own context. A quiet confidence. You glance once more toward the entrance, where the light has softened further, hinting at the approach of evening. Outside, other shelters in other places would be responding to this same shift in their own ways, each one shaped by different choices, different traditions, yet the goal remains the same: to find comfort, to endure. You rest your hands on your knees, feeling the steady temperature around you, and you begin to understand that while the Earth Lodge is just one solution among many, it represents a particularly elegant response to the challenge of desert heat. Simple, grounded, enduring. You sit quietly as the lodge settles deeper into the softening light of late day, and your thoughts begin to drift toward the many assumptions people often make about shelters like this. Ideas are shaped more by distance than by understanding. From the outside, such a structure might seem simple, even primitive to an unfamiliar eye. a low mound of earth that appears almost too modest to hold the complexity you have now begun to feel within it. But that impression fades quickly once you experience it. It always does. Misleading at first glance, you glance slowly around the curved interior again, noticing how every element serves a purpose, how nothing feels excessive, yet nothing feels missing. The balance is quiet but precise, shaped by generations of observation rather than a single moment of invention. And yet many early outsiders failed to recognize this, interpreting these lodges through their own expectations of architecture, often overlooking the intelligence embedded in their design. A common misunderstanding. Historians often point out that early European observers sometimes describe such homes as crude or temporary, assuming that durability required stone or formal structure. But this perspective missed something essential: the idea that strength can come from flexibility, that endurance can be built through adaptation rather than rigidity. The lodge does not resist the land, it works with it. A different philosophy. You rest your hand lightly against the wall again, feeling that steady coolness, and it becomes difficult to imagine calling this space anything less than carefully engineered. The materials may be simple, but their arrangement is not accidental. The layering, the air flow, the positioning, all of it reflects a deep familiarity with environment and need. It is deliberate. There's an interesting and often overlooked detail that adds to this misunderstanding. Some people assume that earth lodges were uncomfortable during extreme weather, particularly in intense heat, believing that a structure made of soil would simply trap warmth. But as you have already felt, the opposite is often true. The thickness of the walls slows heat transfer, creating a cooler interior during the hottest hours. A quiet reversal. Still, there is some scholarly debate about how consistently this effect was achieved, especially in regions with more extreme desert conditions. While the general principles remain, effective variations in soil composition, construction methods, and maintenance could influence how well a particular lodge performed. Not all were identical, but many worked well. You shift slightly, listening to the faint, softened sounds from outside, now gentler as evening approaches, and you begin to realize how much of this misunderstanding comes from not experiencing the space directly. It is one thing to observe from outside, it is another to sit within, to feel the air, the temperature, the calm. Experience changes perception. You take a slow breath and the air still feels balanced, carrying that subtle scent of earth and dried grass, grounding and steady. Nothing about this space feels accidental. It feels refined, even if that refinement came slowly, shaped by time rather than design drawings or formal plans. There is no blueprint, only knowledge, passed on. You glance toward the entrance, again where the light has softened into a warmer tone, and you imagine how easily someone unfamiliar with this structure might overlook its effectiveness, especially when compared to more visibly complex buildings. It does not advertise its function, it simply performs it, quietly, without display. Historians generally agree that many traditional building techniques around the world were undervalued for similar reasons, their effectiveness hidden behind unfamiliar forms or materials. Only later did researchers begin to recognize the sophistication of these methods, often rediscovering principles that had been used for generations. A delayed appreciation. You rest your hands on your knees, feeling the steady coolness around you, and reflect on how this lodge challenges assumptions not by argument but by presence. It demonstrates its value through experience, through comfort, through the simple fact that it works. That is enough. There is still some uncertainty about how widespread these misunderstandings were across different regions and time periods, but it is clear that perception often lagged behind reality. What seemed simple was often deeply complex, shaped by knowledge that did not always translate easily across cultures. Understanding takes time. You close your eyes briefly, letting the calm of the space settle around you once more, and when you open them again, the lodge feels even more complete. Not just as a structure, but as an idea, one that challenges the notion that sophistication must be visible to be real. It does not need to impress, only to endure. And as you sit there, surrounded by quiet design and steady air, you begin to see how easily something essential can be overlooked and how much there is to learn when you take the time to step inside. You remain seated as the light near the entrance softens further, and your attention begins to drift beyond the lodge itself outward toward the surrounding land, where subtle elements play a quiet role in shaping the comfort you feel inside. The structure does not exist in isolation. It is part of a larger system, one that includes the presence of water even in a place that appears dry at first glance. The desert is not empty, it simply hides its resources. You take a slow breath and the air carries that same grounded scent, but now you imagine how it might change near a riverbank or a seasonal stream where moisture lingers just beneath the surface. That presence, even when not visible, can influence the temperature of the surrounding soil, allowing the earth to retain a slightly cooler baseline. A hidden influence. You shift slightly, letting your fingers press into the ground again, and you consider how proximity to water would enhance the cooling effect of a structure like this. Soil that holds more moisture tends to absorb and release heat differently, often maintaining a steadier, cooler temperature during the day. This would subtly improve the comfort within the lodge, even without any visible change. You might not notice it, but you would feel it. Historians and environmental researchers often note that settlements were rarely placed at random, especially in challenging climates. Access to water, whether permanent or seasonal, played a critical role in determining where people built their homes. The presence of a nearby water source could influence not only survival, but also comfort, a strategic choice. Still, there is some uncertainty about how directly these cooling benefits were factored into site selection, as water access was often prioritized for more immediate needs such as drinking, cooking, and agriculture. The cooling effect may have been an added advantage rather than the primary reason, an unintended benefit. Perhaps you glance toward the entrance again, imagining a landscape just beyond it where a narrow stream winds quietly through dry terrain, its surface reflecting the softening light of evening. The air near such a place would feel slightly different, carrying a hint of moisture, a softness that contrasts with the sharper dryness of open desert. You can almost smell it, a faint freshness. You remain still for a moment, letting that imagined contrast settle in your mind, and you begin to understand how even small variations in environment can shape the experience of living within this lodge. The structure provides stability, but the land around it adds nuanced, subtle shifts that enhance or alter its effect. Everything connects. There's interesting detail that sometimes appears in studies of traditional settlements. In certain cases, vegetation was encouraged or maintained near living areas not only for food or materials, but also for its ability to provide shade and influence local microclimates. Even a small amount of plant life can reduce ground temperature and alter airflow in meaningful ways. A quiet adjustment. You rest your hands loosely on your knees, again feeling the steady coolness beneath you, and imagine how the lodge might feel if placed in slightly different conditions, perhaps farther from water, where the soil is drier, the air sharper, the cooling effect still present but less pronounced. A subtle difference, but noticeable. Historians generally agree that such environmental factors played a role in shaping daily life, even if they were not always documented in detail. The relationship between structure and setting is complex, influenced by countless small variables that are difficult to measure, but easy to feel. Experience over measurement. You take a slow breath and the air inside the lodge remains balanced, but now you sense how it might carry faint traces of the outside environment's subtle changes that reflect the land beyond the walls. The lodge filters the desert, but it does not fully separate from it. It stays connected. There is still some debate about how much control people had over these environmental influences, especially in regions where water sources were unpredictable or seasonal. Adaptation would have been necessary, adjusting to changes in availability and location over time. Nothing is fixed. Everything shifts. You glance upward once more at the opening above, where the light has now softened into a gentle glow, and you consider how the lodge, the land, and the presence of water all work together to create a space that feels far more comfortable than the harsh surroundings might suggest. A layered system, quietly effective, and as you sit there aware of these hidden connections, You begin to understand that staying cool in the desert was never just about building the right structure. It was about choosing the right place, reading the land carefully, and allowing even the smallest elements to contribute to comfort. A careful balance. Shaped by observation, sustained over time, you sit quietly as evening continues its slow approach and your attention begins to turn toward the process behind everything you have been experiencing, the careful, methodical creation of a space that feels so effortless once complete. It is easy to forget that this calm did not appear on its own. It was built, step by step, with intention. You imagine the beginning, an open patch of land, chosen carefully. The ground would be studied first, not just for convenience, but for stability, for how it holds moisture, for how it responds to heat. A slight elevation might be preferred, or perhaps a place where water does not easily collect during rare rains. The decision matters more than it seems. Everything starts here. You picture the first movements, tools pressing into the soil, hands working steadily to dig a shallow depression into the earth. Not too deep, just enough to lower the living space below the surrounding surface, allowing the natural coolness of the ground to become part of the structure from the very beginning. A quiet foundation. You can almost hear it. The soft scrape of tools against soil, the dull thud of earth being moved and shaped, the low murmur of voices coordinating the work. It is not rushed. It cannot be. Each step depends on the one before it. Patience is required. Once the ground is prepared, the framework begins to take shape. Strong wooden posts set firmly into place, forming a circular outline that defines the boundaries of the lodge. These posts are not random. Their placement determines everything that follows, from the stability of the roof to the flow of space within. Structure emerges. You look upward at again, imagining those beams being lifted and carefully positioned, angled inward to meet at the top, creating that familiar rounded form. Each piece must align just enough to support the weight that will soon rest upon it. A careful balance. There is an interesting detail that often goes unnoticed. The selection of wood itself was important not just for strength but for flexibility and durability. Certain types of trees would have been chosen for how they respond to pressure and time. Materials matter. Historians generally agree that this stage required both skill and experience, as mistakes in this framework could compromise the entire structure. Yet there is still some uncertainty about how standardized these methods were across different groups, as local resources and traditions likely influenced the exact techniques used. No single blueprint, only shared knowledge. You shift slightly, imagining the next layer. Branches and smaller pieces of wood laid across the frame, forming a woven surface that begins to close the space. These layers create gaps, small pockets where air can settle, contributing to the insulating effect that defines the lodge's cooling ability. Air becomes part of it. You can almost feel the texture of those materials, rough, uneven, yet carefully arranged to support what comes next. Over this, grasses and other plant materials are added, creating another layer of separation between the interior and the outside world. Layer by layer, the process continues. You take a slow breath as you imagine the final stage earth being piled over the entire structure, gradually covering it until it blends into the land itself. This is the moment when the lodge begins to disappear from view, transforming from a constructed space into something that feels natural, almost inevitable. It becomes the land. You rest your hand against the wall again, feeling the result of that process, the packed earth that now holds steady around you. It is difficult to imagine the effort it took to build, because the final form feels so simple, so complete. A hidden effort. There is a lesser-known detail that adds depth to this process. In some cases, the outer surface may have been shaped and smoothed carefully to improve durability, allowing water to run off more easily and reducing erosion over time. A quiet refinement. You sit back again, letting your body relax into the steady coolness, and you begin to understand how each step in this process contributes directly to the comfort you feel now. Swing is decorative. Nothing is unnecessary. Everything serves a purpose. Outside, the desert continues its slow transition toward evening. But inside the lodge holds its balance, the result of careful planning and patient construction that began long before this moment. You take another slow breath. The air remains calm, unchanged. There is still some debate among historians about how long it would take to construct a lodge like this, as the timeline likely varied depending on available labour materials and environmental conditions. Some may have been completed relatively quickly, while others took more time. It depends, as many things do, and as you sit there, surrounded by the quiet result of this layered process, you begin to see how the true effectiveness of the lodge lies not in any single element, but in the way each step builds upon the last, creating a structure that feels simple only because it has been so carefully refined. Built slowly, meant to last. You remain still as the last warmth of the day begins to soften, and gradually your awareness shifts away from sight and towards something quieter, something easier to overlook the sound of this place, or rather the way sound behaves within it. At first it seems like silence, but it is not silence. It is something gentler, a softened world. You listen more closely now, allowing your attention to settle into the faintest details. The low murmur of air moving through the entrance, the distant whisper of wind brushing across the outer surface, the subtle creak of wood adjusting, almost imperceptibly under the slow shift of temperature. None of it feels sharp. None of it demands attention. Everything is muted. You take a slow breath, and even that sound feels contained, as though the lodge itself is absorbing the edges of it before it can travel too far. The curved walls, the layered materials, the packed earth, all of it contributes to this effect, softening sound waves and preventing them from echoing harshly. No sharp echoes here, just presence. You shift your weight slightly, and the faint sound of movement is barely noticeable, quickly settling back into the quiet. It becomes clear that this space is not designed to amplify noise, but to hold it gently, to keep it close and controlled. A natural acoustics. Historians and researchers who study traditional dwellings often note that structures made from earth and organic materials tend to absorb sound more effectively than those built from harder surfaces like stone or metal. This creates an environment that feels calmer, less intrusive, particularly when multiple people share the same space. Still, there is some uncertainty about whether this acoustic effect was intentionally considered during construction or simply an incidental benefit of the materials used. It may not have been planned, but it certainly mattered. You tilt your head slightly, listening again, and this time you notice something even subtler, the absence of certain sounds. Outside, the wind can carry a constant dry hiss across the landscape, but here that sharpness is gone. It arrives softened, transformed into something closer to a distant breath. Filtered gently, you imagine a group of people inside this lodge, their voices low, their movements unhurried, and how the sound of their presence would blend together rather than compete. Conversations would not need to rise above background noise because there is no background noise demanding attention. A quiet harmony. You rest your hands on the ground again, feeling the steady coolness beneath your palms, and notice how even the small contact produces almost no sound, just a faint shift that disappears as quickly as it begins. The space absorbs it. You take another slow breath and the air feels calm, carrying only the softest traces of movement. The lodge does not silence the world completely. It reshapes it, allowing only what can exist without disruption. There is an interesting detail that sometimes appears in observations of similar structures. In environments where sound carries easily across open land, having a space that reduces and contains noise can create a sense of privacy that might otherwise be difficult to achieve. A subtle protection. You glance toward the entrance again where the light has dimmed further, and imagine how different the sound would be just outside, the wind louder, the air more open, the small noises more scattered and less contained. A sharper world. You remain where you are, choosing the quiet. Historians generally agree that the sensory experience of living in such structures extends beyond temperature alone, shaping how people perceive space, time, and interaction. Sound, though often overlooked, plays a significant role in creating a sense of calm and stability. It shapes mood. Without effort, there is still some debate about how much importance was placed on this aspect of design, as written records rarely focus on sensory experience in detail. Much of what we understand comes from reconstruction, observation, and comparison with similar environments. An incomplete picture, but meaningful. You close your eyes briefly, letting the softened sound settle around you, and the effect becomes even more noticeable. Without visual distraction, the quiet feels deeper, more complete, as if the lodge is holding you within a gentle layer of stillness. A calming closure. You open your eyes again and nothing has changed yet. Everything feels slightly more defined, the quiet more intentional, the space more complete. And as you sit there listening to the absence of harsh sound, you begin to understand how this lodge does more than cool the body. It calms the senses, creating an environment where even noise becomes gentle, where the outside world is softened just enough to make it livable. Not silent, but peaceful. You remain seated as the quiet deepens, and gradually your awareness shifts again, this time towards something even more subtle, the scent of the space around you. Something that has been present all along, but only now begins to fully reveal itself. It is not a single smell. It is a blend, layered, gentle. You take a slow breath. The earth speaks softly. There is the grounding scent of soil, cool and steady, carrying a faint trace of moisture hidden deep below the surface. It is not damp, but it is not dry, either, resting somewhere in between, a balanced presence that feels natural and calming at once. It lingers quietly, never sharp. You notice another layer beneath it, a faint sweetness, perhaps from dried grasses woven into the structure, their scent softened by time, but still present enough to be felt when you breathe deeply. It adds a subtle warmth to the air, something almost comforting, like a memory that has settled into the walls. You breathe again, slowly. The combination is gentle, never overwhelming, never artificial. It does not demand your attention, but once you notice it, it becomes part of the experience, grounding you in the space in a way that feels both physical and emotional. A quiet connection. Historians and anthropologists often note that the sensory environment of traditional dwellings plays a significant role in how people experience comfort, even if it is rarely documented in detail. Smell in particular can influence perception in ways that are difficult to measure, but easy to feel. Still, there is some uncertainty about how consistent these scents would have been across different lodges, as variations in materials, location and maintenance could create subtle differences from one structure to another. No two exactly alike, but similar. You shift slightly, and as you do, the scent changes just enough to notice a reminder that even within this enclosed space, there are layers and variations depending on where you sit, how the air moves, how the materials respond. It is alive, in its own way. You glance toward the entrance, imagining how the outside air might carry sharper, drier scents. Heated dust, sun-warmed vegetation, the faint trace of distant earth baking under the sun. Compared to that, the interior feels softened, moderated not only in temperature but in smell. A filtered atmosphere. You close your eyes briefly, allowing the scent to settle more fully, and the effect is immediate, calming, grounding, almost meditative. The absence of harsh or unfamiliar smells allows your senses to relax, to settle into something predictable and steady. A familiar presence. There is an interesting detail that sometimes appears in studies of similar structures. In certain cases, natural materials used in construction may have contributed to reducing unpleasant odors, absorbing and neutralizing them over time, much like they absorb sound and heat. A quiet function, often unnoticed. You rest your hands lightly on the ground again, and even that simple contact seems to reinforce the sensory experience, the coolness beneath your palms paired with the earthy scent in the air, creating a sense of completeness that feels difficult to separate into parts. Everything blends seamlessly. Historians generally agree that such environments would have felt distinctly different from open air, not just in temperature but in the way they engage the senses. The lodge does not isolate you completely. It reshapes the experience of the world, softening its edges. There is still some debate about how much attention was consciously given to these sensory qualities during construction or whether they emerged naturally from the materials and methods used. The result, however, remains consistent. Comfort beyond function. You take another slow breath and the scent feels steady, unchanged, a constant presence that supports the calm you have been settling into. It does not fade. It does not intensify. It simply remains. Reliable, Quiet, grounded. You open your eyes again and the lodge feels even more complete now. Not just a place you can see or touch, but a place you can breathe in, a space that surrounds you fully without ever overwhelming you. And as you sit there aware of this subtle layered scent, you begin to understand how staying cool in the desert was not only about temperature, but about creating an environment that feels stable, familiar, and deeply connected to the land itself. A place you can settle into, without effort, without resistance. You remain seated as the evening light continues to soften, and without quite realizing it, your attention shifts from scent and sound towards something more immediate. The physical sensation of the space itself, the way it feels against your body in small, constant ways that quietly shape your sense of comfort. You move your hand slowly across the ground again, noticing how the surface responds with that familiar coolness, steady and reassuring, never sharp, never fading, just present in a way that feels dependable over time. It is not soft in the way of fabric, yet it does not feel harsh either, existing somewhere in between, a firmness that supports without pressing back too strongly. You adjust your posture slightly, letting your weight settle more fully against the curved wall, and the sensation shifts just enough to notice the cool earth meeting the warmth of your back, absorbing it gently without becoming warm itself. It is a quiet exchange, one that happens continuously without drawing attention, yet once you notice it, it becomes impossible to ignore. The structure is not passive, it interacts. You take a slow breath and the air feels smooth against your skin, neither dry enough to irritate nor heavy enough to weigh down your senses. This balance is subtle, but it shapes everything from how easily you breathe to how relaxed your muscles feel in this space. Outside, the desert air can feel sharp, almost abrasive at times, but here it is softened, moderated, shaped into something that your body can accept without resistance. A steady comfort. You press your fingers lightly into the ground again, noticing how the surface gives just slightly under pressure, not enough to shift, but enough to feel responsive. This is not a rigid floor. It has been shaped, compacted, refined through use, creating a surface that adapts in small ways to the presence of those who move across it. It remembers movement. There is an interesting detail that often goes unnoticed. Over time, repeated use of the same areas within the lodge would subtly alter the texture of the ground, smoothing some sections, firming others, creating a landscape within the space that reflects patterns of daily life. A quiet imprint. Historians generally agree that such tactile experiences played an important role in how people interacted with their environment, even if these details were rarely recorded in written accounts. The way a space feels underfoot or against the skin can influence behavior just as much as temperature or light. Still, there is some uncertainty about how much attention was consciously given to these tactile qualities during construction, or whether they emerged naturally as a result of materials and use. The outcome, however, remains consistent. Comfort you can feel. You shift again, letting your hands rest on your knees, and notice how your body has begun to relax more deeply. Your movement slower, your posture less guarded. The environment encourages this without effort, not by forcing stillness, but by removing the need for tension. You do not need to adjust constantly. You can simply remain. Outside, the last heat of the day lingers across the land, but it no longer presses inward with the same intensity. Inside, the lodge continues to hold its steady balance, the coolness beneath you, unchanged, the air around you calm and even. A stable space. There is a subtle contrast you begin to appreciate more clearly. Now, the difference between surfaces that radiate heat and those that absorb it. Outside, the ground often pushes warmth back into your body, creating a constant exchange that builds discomfort. Here, the opposite occurs, the earth drawing heat away, slowly reducing that pressure. A quiet relief. You take another slow breath and the sensation of the space feels complete, not defined by any single element, but by the combination of touch, air, and stillness working together. It is not something you have to think about. It is something you feel continuously without interruption. There is still some debate among historians about how these sensory aspects of traditional dwellings influenced long-term health and well-being, as direct evidence is limited. However, it is widely suggested that environments which reduce physical stress can contribute to overall comfort and resilience. It makes sense. Even without you lean back slightly, letting your body rest fully against the wall, and the coolness remains steady, unchanged by your presence, a constant that does not fluctuate with small movements or shifts in position. Reliable, consistent, grounded. And as you sit there aware of how the space feels against your skin, beneath your feet, around your body, you begin to understand that staying cool in the desert was not just about lowering temperature, but about creating an environment that supports the body in quiet, continuous ways. Not dramatic, but lasting. You remain settled in that steady comfort as the last light of evening begins to thin, and your thoughts drift towards something less physical, but no less present, the meaning carried within a space like this, the quiet symbolism that exists beneath its practical design. The lodge is not only a response to heat, it is also a reflection of how people understand their place in the world, how they relate to the land beneath them and the sky above. You sit still, letting that idea settle slowly. The curved walls around you no longer just structural, but suggestive, almost intentional in a way that goes beyond function. A deeper layer. You glance upward toward the opening again, where the fading light now appears softer, more distant, and you begin to notice how naturally your gaze is drawn between ground and sky within this space. The floor anchors you, cool and steady, while the opening above connects you outward, a quiet reminder that even within shelter, you remain part of a larger environment. It is not closed, it is connected, a quiet balance. Historians and anthropologists often suggest that many traditional structures carry symbolic meaning, even when their primary purpose is practical, and in some interpretations the Earth Lodge has been seen as representing a kind of harmony between human life and the natural world. The circular shape, the use of earth, the central opening, all of these elements can be understood not just as functional choices, but as reflections of a worldview. Still, there is some uncertainty about how universally these symbolic meanings were shared across different groups, as interpretations may vary depending on cultural context, oral traditions, and historical perspective. Not every builder would have described the lodge in the same way. Meaning is not always fixed. You rest your hands lightly on your knees again, feeling the steady coolness beneath you, and consider how the act of living within such a space might shape the way you think about comfort. Not as something separate from the environment, but as something created through alignment with it. A different perspective. There is an interesting detail that sometimes appears in ethnographic accounts. In certain communities, the act of building a lodge was not only a practical task, but also a communal event that carried social and sometimes ceremonial significance, reinforcing connections between people as well as between people and place. More than construction, a shared act. You take a slow breath and the air remains calm, unchanged in its gentle movement, and you begin to sense how this space encourages a kind of awareness that is easy to overlook in more controlled environments. There is no separation between inside and outside that feels absolute. The lodge mediates the relationship rather than breaking it. It keeps you grounded, literally. You shift slightly, letting your back rest more fully against the wall, and the sensation reinforces that connection, the earth supporting you, holding its temperature, maintaining its quiet presence without effort or resistance. It does not impose itself. It simply exists, and you exist within it. A shared space. There is still some debate among historians about how much symbolic meaning can be confidently attributed to such structures, without imposing later interpretations, as much of the original understanding would have been passed through oral tradition rather than written record. This makes it difficult to separate intention from interpretation. The line is unclear, but meaningful. You glance once more toward the entrance, now dim the outside world transitioning fully into evening, and you consider how the lodge continues to function in both physical and symbolic ways at once, offering comfort, while also shaping a sense of place and belonging. It does both. Without effort, you take another slow breath and the air feels unchanged, steady, reliable, and you begin to understand how this structure supports not just survival, but a way of thinking, one that values balance, connection, and quiet adaptation over control or dominance. a gentle philosophy. You remain still, letting that idea settle the curved walls, the cool ground, the soft air, all of it forming a space that feels complete in more ways than one, a place where function and meaning exist together without conflict. And as you sit there aware of both the physical and symbolic layers of this lodge, you begin to see how staying cool in the desert was not only a matter of engineering, but also a reflection of how people understood their relationship with the land itself. Not separate, but connected. You remain still as evening settles more fully, and your thoughts begin to drift toward the people themselves. Not just how they lived within this space, but how they learned to build it. How knowledge like this moved quietly from one generation to the next without ever needing to be written down. The lodge you sit in is not an isolated idea. It is the result of memory practice and careful observation repeated over time. You can almost sense those layers of knowledge around you as present as the earth itself. It was taught slowly, not explained all at once. You imagine younger members of the community watching as older builders work not through formal instruction but through repetition, through participation, through being present during each step of the process. The digging, the placement of beams, the layering of materials, each action becoming familiar not through theory but through experience, learning by doing. You shift your hand along the ground again, feeling the steady surface beneath your fingers, and consider how this kind of knowledge is different from something written or measured. It lives in movement, in memory in the body as much as in the mind. You do not memorize it, you absorb it, over time, gradually. Historians generally agree that many traditional construction techniques were passed down through oral and practical traditions, with knowledge embedded in daily life rather than recorded in formal texts. This allowed skills to remain flexible, adapting as conditions changed, rather than becoming fixed in a single form. Still, there is some uncertainty about how much variation existed between different groups, as the lack of written records makes it difficult to trace exact methods across regions and generations. What we understand now is often reconstructed from observation and comparison. An incomplete record, but a meaningful one. You glance around the lodge again, and it becomes easier to imagine how each detail here represents not just a decision, but a remembered solution, something discovered, tested and kept because it worked. The thickness of the walls, the shape of the roof, the placement of the opening above. Nothing random, everything learned. There is an interesting detail that sometimes appears in accounts of traditional knowledge systems. Skills like these were often taught in context, meaning that learning did not happen in isolation, but alongside other activities within the rhythm of daily life. Building was not separate from living, it was part of it. Integrated knowledge. You take a slow breath and the air remains calm, carrying that familiar balance you have come to expect, and you begin to understand how this environment itself would reinforce learning. When a structure works well, when it provides comfort and stability, its value becomes obvious without explanation. You feel the result and remember it. You shift slightly, letting your back rest again against the wall, and consider how this knowledge would continue passed on through repetition, through observation, through quiet correction, when something did not quite work as intended. Small adjustments. There is still some debate among historians about how much innovation occurred within these traditions versus how much was preserved unchanged. Some suggest that techniques remained relatively stable, while others argue that continuous refinement played a significant role in improving effectiveness over time. The truth likely sits between, as it often does. You glance toward the entrance, now dim with evening light, and imagine how many times this process has repeated. How many lodges have been built, used, repaired and rebuilt, each one carrying forward the knowledge of those that came before. A continuous thread, unbroken. You take another slow breath and the air feels steady, unchanged, as if the lodge itself holds not only physical comfort, but also the memory of the knowledge that created it. It is not just a structure, it is a result of understanding preserved through action rather than words. A living tradition. You remain still for a moment longer, letting that idea settle, and you begin to see how staying cool in the desert was never just about a single invention, but about a process of learning that never truly ends. adapting, refining, and continuing across time, always evolving quietly, without interruption. You remain seated as night begins to settle across the land outside, and your thoughts shift gently towards something less often considered: the limitations of this space, the quiet challenges that exist alongside its comfort. Because no solution, no matter how thoughtful, exists without trade-offs. The lodge feels balanced. It feels effective. But it is not perfect. Nothing ever is. You rest your hand once more against the wall, feeling its steady coolness, and begin to consider how that same thickness that protects you from heat might also create constraints, reducing light, limiting visibility, shaping how space can be used during certain times of day. The dim interior that feels calming now might feel restrictive in other moments. A gentle constraint. You glance upward toward the opening where the last traces of light are fading, and it becomes clear how much the space depends on that single source of illumination. During the day it provides just enough, but at night, without fire, the interior would fall into near darkness, requiring careful movement and awareness. Light is limited by design. You shift slightly, imagining how the enclosed nature of the lodge might affect airflow under different conditions, especially if the outside air becomes still or unusually warm. While the structure promotes circulation, it is still dependent on environmental differences to function at its best. It cannot create wind, only guide it. Historians often note that traditional structures like this are highly effective within the conditions they were designed for, but may become less comfortable when those conditions shift beyond expected patterns. Extreme weather, unusual heat, or prolonged dryness could influence how well the system performs. Still, it holds, most of the time. There is an interesting detail that sometimes appears in historical accounts. Maintenance was not optional. Without regular care, small cracks in the outer layers could allow heat to penetrate more quickly, reducing the effectiveness of the insulation over time. It requires attention, ongoing care. You run your fingers lightly along the wall, imagining how such small imperfections might feel subtle at first, barely noticeable, but gradually affecting the overall balance of the space if left unaddressed. The lodge works well because it is maintained, because it is part of an ongoing relationship rather than a finished object. Never truly complete, always in use. You take a slow breath and the air still feels calm, though perhaps slightly cooler now as night approaches, and you consider how the same structure that protects from heat must also respond to cooler temperatures, requiring adjustments in how it is used. A shifting role, day to night. There is still some debate among historians about how people manage these transitions in different climates, particularly in regions where temperature swings between day and night were more extreme. Some suggest that additional coverings or internal adjustments may have been used, while others believe the structure alone was often sufficient. The details vary. As they often do, you glance toward the entrance again, now mostly dark, and imagine how stepping outside would feel different now, the air cooler, the intensity of the day replaced by a quieter, more forgiving atmosphere. The lodge would no longer serve as a refuge from heat alone, but as a stable space within a cooling world. Its purpose shifts, gently. You rest your hands on your knees, feeling the steady ground beneath you, and reflect on how these limitations do not diminish the value of the lodge, but instead reveal its nature more clearly. It is not a perfect solution, it is a balanced one, designed for reality. Not perfection. Historians generally agree that traditional structures often reflect this kind of balance, shaped by practical needs and environmental constraints rather than idealized conditions. They work because they are grounded in experience, not theory. Tested over time, you take another slow breath and the air remains steady, unchanged in its quiet movement, and you begin to understand that the effectiveness of this space lies not in eliminating every challenge, but in reducing them enough to make life sustainable. That is enough, more than enough. And as you sit there aware of both the strengths and the limits of this lodge, you begin to see how staying cool in the desert was never about perfection, but about finding a workable balance, one that could be maintained, adjusted, and relied upon over time. A practical solution. Quietly endure. You remain still as night settles more fully around the lodge, and your thoughts drift toward those who encountered spaces like this for the first time from the outside. Unfamiliar eyes trying to understand something shaped by a completely different way of living. It is easy to imagine that first impression, the low mound of earth, unremarkable at a distance, blending so naturally into the land that it almost disappears. Easy to overlook. You picture someone approaching it slowly, much like you did, unsure of what to expect, perhaps carrying assumptions shaped by their own experience of shelter, expecting height structure, something more visibly defined. And then stepping inside, feeling that immediate shift in temperature, that quiet drop in heat that does not announce itself loudly but settles gently across the skin. A quiet surprise. Early explorers and settlers who documented such encounters often expressed a mix of curiosity and misunderstanding, sometimes noting the comfort of these structures, while at other times failing to fully grasp how they achieved it. Their descriptions varied widely, influenced by their expectations and the conditions they experienced. Not always accurate, but revealing. Historians generally agree that these early accounts provide valuable insight, though they must be read carefully as they often reflect the perspective of outsiders, rather than the lived experience of those who built and used the lodges. What seems unusual from one viewpoint may be entirely natural from another. Perspective shapes understanding. You shift slightly, letting your hand rest once more against the cool wall, and imagine how these encounters might have felt for those who lived here, watching others attempt to interpret something that to them required no explanation. It simply worked. There is an interesting detail that sometimes appears in historical writings. Some observers noted the difference in comfort, quite clearly describing how stepping inside provided relief from heat, even if they could not fully explain why. Others, however, dismissed these structures as temporary or unsophisticated, overlooking the knowledge embedded within them. A divided impression. You take a slow breath and the air remains steady, unchanged, and you begin to see how understanding does not always arrive immediately. It often takes time, experience, and a willingness to set aside assumptions in order to recognize the value of something unfamiliar. Not everyone did. At first, there is still some debate among historians about how widely these observations influenced later architectural thinking, as the transfer of knowledge between cultures was often uneven, shaped by context, power, and perception. Some ideas were noticed, others were ignored. Selective understanding. You glance toward the entrance now, dark, the outside world quiet and distant, and imagine how many times this moment has repeated, someone stepping inside, feeling the shift, recognizing something subtle but important. A moment of realization. You remain where you are, letting that thought settle, and consider how this lodge does not reveal its function through appearance alone. It must be experienced. It must be felt. Only then does its design become fully clear. Experience reveals it. You rest your hands on your knees again, feeling the steady ground beneath you, and reflect on how easily effective solutions can be overlooked when they do not match expectations, when they do not appear complex or impressive at first glance. Simplicity can mislead. Historians often emphasize the importance of re-examining such structures with a deeper understanding, recognizing that what may seem simple is often the result of long refinement and careful adaptation. A hidden sophistication. You take another slow breath and the air remains calm, unchanged, and you begin to understand how this space challenges not only the heat of the desert, but also the assumptions of those who encounter it without context. It asks for patience, to be understood, and as you sit there surrounded by a quiet design and steady comfort, you begin to see how the true value of this lodge is not always immediately visible, but becomes clear through experience, through presence, through time spent within its walls. A quiet lesson, waiting to be felt. You remain seated as the night deepens fully outside and your thoughts begin to drift forward in time, beyond this moment, beyond this place, toward how ideas like this continue quietly into the present, often unnoticed, woven into modern approaches to building and comfort. The lodge may feel ancient, but its principles are not. They persist. You take a slow breath and the air remains calm and steady, and you begin to consider how the same ideas you've been experiencing here, insulation, airflow, thermal balance, are now discussed in an entirely different language studied. measured and applied in contemporary design. Different words, same understanding. Modern architects and engineers often refer to concepts like passive cooling and thermal mass methods that reduce the need for artificial temperature control by working with natural conditions rather than against them. These ideas, though framed in scientific terms, echo what has been practiced here for generations. Nothing truly new, only rediscovered. Historians and researchers frequently point out that many sustainable building practices draw inspiration from traditional knowledge, even if that connection is not always acknowledged directly. The use of earth as insulation, the careful positioning of openings for airflow, the balance between structure and environment, all of these appear again in modern design. A quiet continuity. You shift slightly, letting your hand rest once more against the wall, and the coolness feels just as steady as before, unchanged by time, unchanged by shifting ideas. The principle remains the same even as the context evolves. It still works. There is an interesting detail that highlights this connection. In some modern buildings, materials like rammed earth or insulated concrete are used specifically to replicate the thermal stability that natural earth provides, slowing the transfer of heat and maintaining more consistent interior temperatures. A familiar idea, refined differently. You glance upward toward the opening above, now dark, and imagine how modern structures sometimes incorporate similar ventilation systems, allowing hot air to rise and escape while drawing cooler air inward. The method may be adjusted, but the concept remains unchanged. Air still moves, as it always has. There is still some debate among historians and designers about how directly traditional methods influence modern architecture, as innovation often blends multiple sources of knowledge. Some ideas are consciously adapted, while others emerge independently in response to similar challenges. Parallel thinking. Across time, you take a slow breath and the air remains steady, and you begin to understand how this lodge is not just a relic of the past, but part of an ongoing conversation between people and environment, one that continues to evolve without ever fully abandoning its roots. A living idea. You rest your hands on your knees, again feeling the ground beneath you, and reflect on how modern solutions often rely on energy, technology, and complexity, while this structure achieves similar results through simplicity, patience, and understanding. Different paths, same goal. Historians generally agree that revisiting traditional techniques can offer valuable insights for sustainable design, particularly in regions where resources are limited or environmental conditions are challenging. The lessons are not outdated, they are enduring. Still relevant, even now. You glance once more toward the entrance where the darkness outside feels calm rather than oppressive, and you consider how the lodge continues to hold its balance, just as it has for generations, quietly demonstrating principles that extend far beyond its immediate purpose. A silent teacher. There is still some uncertainty about how widely these ideas will continue to influence future design as technology advances and priorities shift, but the core principles remain difficult to ignore. They make sense. On a basic level, you take another slow breath and the air feels unchanged, steady, reliable, and you begin to see how staying cool in the desert was never just a problem to solve, but an opportunity to understand, to observe, and to work with the environment rather than against it. A lesson that continues across time, and as you sit there surrounded by the quiet effectiveness of this space, you begin to understand how its legacy is not only in the past, but in the ideas it carries forward, shaping how people think about comfort, sustainability, and the relationship between shelter and the natural world. Enduring, without effort, you remain where you are as the night settles completely, the last traces of daylight gone, leaving only the quiet presence of the lodge around you steady and unchanged, as if time itself has slowed to match its rhythm. The air feels cooler now, but not cold, just gently settled, held within the same calm balance that has followed you from the heat of the day into the stillness of night. You do not need to move. Everything you need is already here. You take a slow breath and the scent of earth feels softer now, deeper somehow, as if the darkness has allowed it to settle more fully into the space. These sounds are quieter too, the faint movement of air, the distant suggestion of a wind outside, all reduced to a gentle background that no longer asks for your attention. It is enough to simply notice it, then let it go. A quiet ending. You rest your hand once more against the ground, feeling that familiar coolness still present, still steady, as if the lodge has been holding this moment in place all along. The surface beneath you does not change, does not shift, it simply supports quietly and without effort. Reliable, unchanging. You lean back slightly, letting your body settle fully into the curve of the wall, and the sensation feels almost weightless. Now your muscles no longer holding tension, you're breathing slow and even. The space does not ask anything of you. It does not demand attention. It simply allows you to rest. That is enough. You glance once more toward the opening above. Now only a faint shape against the darkness, and you can imagine the sky beyond it, wide and still, stretching far above the shelter that holds you here. You are inside, but not separated. You are part of both. A quiet connection. Historians may continue to discuss how structures like this were built, how they functioned, how they adapted across time and place, but in this moment none of that feels urgent. The knowledge exists, but the experience is what remains with you. The feeling of balance, of calm, of being held within something that works without needing to be explained. Still, there is always some uncertainty, some details that remain just out of reach, shaped by time, by memory, by the quiet gaps between what was lived and what was recorded. And perhaps that is part of it too. Not everything needs to be known. You take another slow breath and the air feels softer still, as if the space itself is settling along with you, the movement of the day fully gone, replaced by a steady, unbroken stillness that feels easy to sink into. You do not need to think anymore. Just rest. The cool earth beneath you continues to hold its quiet temperature, the walls around you steady and unmoving, the air calm and balanced. There is nothing sharp here, nothing sudden, nothing that pulls you away from this slow, gentle rhythm. Everything has softened, even time, and as you remain there, supported by the quiet strength of the lodge, you begin to feel how naturally the body responds to this kind of space, how easily tension fades when the environment no longer demands constant adjustment. You're simply here, breathing slowly, letting go. The desert outside continues its endless cycles, heat and cooling, light and darkness. But inside the lodge holds its steady presence, a small, quiet place shaped by understanding, by patience, by a long relationship with the land. A place of balance, a place of rest. You take one final slow breath and the air feels calm, familiar. And as your awareness begins to drift, the details of the space soften, blending together into a single steady sensation that carries you gently towards sleep. Nothing urgent remains, only quiet, only stillness, only rest. Sweet dreams.